Have you ever even recently felt discouraged about something? Disappointed, frazzled, just worn down? Bring that up because in that first reading, we hear about Elijah. And we need to understand, Elijah was considered a great prophet, one of the greatest since Moses had come centuries before. He was looked up to by all the people. He had great faith. He stood his ground against the king and his wife Jezebel, and just everything he did showed great faith and conviction and strength. But we see today, not so much. He had just confronted the royal palace there beforehand, and he left, and he got clear awareness that Jezebel, by the way, any of you would ever name your kid Jezebel? You know? Jezebel, the wicked queen, that she was doing everything and telling people, go get Elijah, put him to death. So Elijah was on the run and he went into the desert. And he was obviously tired. He had done so much good. He had touched many lives. He had inspired folks with great faith. But through it all, one thing after another, and now this, he was worn down. And so in that desert, basically under this broom tree, which is like a desert bush, he's sitting there, and his lament to the Lord is, Lord, enough. This is enough. I'm tired. I want to die. You know? And that was Elijah. And we probably can't fully appreciate not only that here's this man of faith who conviction and did many good things, but he could be down from time to time, and was. Because sometimes we look at people of faith and always hold them up and, wow, they must always be alive in God and always centered in the Lord. You know, but here we see, no. And in addition to that, we need to appreciate in the Jewish tradition, very different from other cultures. Many of the other cultures around them were cultures that if there was somebody who was a leader or who was prominent, they never pointed out any weakness in that person. Any leader in their stories that they told and passed on, the leader was great and noble and did wonderful things. You didn't hear about their vulnerability. But the Jewish tradition, yeah. They were able to speak of Elijah and say, hey, he had his difficult moments. Think about it. Even in our Christian tradition, the scriptures make clear that Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane struggled. He sweat blood. He didn't want to have to face that. We're reminded that God works through us all, whoever we are. At times we can be weak. And we don't need to be ashamed of that. And we know we may go through some difficult periods and somehow with the Lord's help eventually come out of it. And many people have said, well, wow, back in Elijah's time, if he can be that way and he's the great prophet, I guess I don't have to put myself down because I have moments like that. Nor do we need to do that. But that story of Elijah reminds me of somebody that I knew many years ago, and I talked about him probably in a homily over a year ago, but his name was Jim. And Jim, in college, he was with a buddy. They were driving fast, and his buddy was driving, got in a big wreck. His buddy was unscathed. Jim ended up being a quadriplegic. And going through all of that, I didn't know him till a few years later, but obviously when all of that happened to him at a young age, around 20, he was resentful, he was angry, he was depressed, he kind of felt that life was over. By the way, he basically shared this story with me when he had gotten better, and he shared it with a lot of people. But I remember asking him, I said, Jim, you know, you're still quadriplegic. You've been dealing with a lot. How is it you have a more positive spirit today? And he made the point. You know, he had his Elijah moment, obviously. No, he had been depressed for a great period of time. He had felt disillusioned about life and angry. And all of those, in a real way, were legitimate feelings to get out and to name and to express and to deal with. And so we talked about that, and I said, well, what helped you? And he said, well, over time, what helped him, his family, and friends. He mentioned how first of all, his parents, but his friends, they were there. They often visited him. And even when he was down and out, even when he was resentful, even when he didn't want to say much, he would say now, when he was in greater recovery, that his friends and family were still there for him. He had given up on himself and on the rest of his life. They had not given up on him, and were always there to encourage, and sometimes just to be with him, not try to say, oh, buck up, feel better. No, just to be with him in his sadness and his grief, and to be that loving presence, which is the greatest thing we can do with and for anybody going through that kind of pain. And so it was a period of time, but eventually he was able to redirect, but it took a while. And what he came to really came from family and friends. The messages they were able to share with him later on when he was ready to hear. And one of them, as he shared, because he gave talks with other people too, he shared that basically he was challenged and loved not to focus on what he couldn't do. He was quadriplegic, but what he could do. He actually had some of these different designs that he could get around a little bit. And he could speak, he's a great speaker. And so he looked at that and he saw that and he realized that, yeah, quadriplegic, but he needed to not be down on himself. That was the bigger issue. And so gradually he was being picked up. Another message he heard that he was passing on was that the physical realm of who we are physically, it's important, obviously, and for him, a lot of that was lost. But over time, maybe because of circumstance and everything, he came to recognize the deepest part of him and part of us all was the spiritual. And so with that sense of spirituality, his soul deep within, his body may be weak, but his soul and spirit was strong over time. And that made a difference. And as he said, eventually he didn't give up because his family didn't give up, and he came to believe God didn't give up. And when you think about that, we can all look at our lives. Jim was an inspiration, but we all know people who we can look at and see, and now look at ourselves. Hey, maybe I'm struggling with something. Maybe I'm hurting. I need to name it. I need to help other people around me, name it for them. I need to just walk with people and even somehow believe that God is walking with me, even though I may not feel it for a while. And again, over time, be renewed. You probably know, some of you, I'm not going to ask the real young ones, know who Winston Churchill was. He was prime minister at the beginning of the war where the bombing was going on in England, even before we entered into the fray. And he was speaking, they were bombing in London, and he was speaking at a commencement address. And the basic essence of what he said, and it was real brief to those people. And he had issues, his issues. He drank too much, he had other problems. But he had a conviction, and he stood tall here with all of England. And his message to those young people in that time, he basically said this: never, 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 never give up. Boy, we ought to take that sign language and be reminded of it. And whatever we go through and whatever our loved ones go through, to somehow believe we will get through it. And remember that spirit that wants to touch and fill each of our lives. Finally, I mentioned Jim, that another thing he spoke about at another time, he talked about the people coming from church that brought him communion. And he told me, he said, when I was growing up, communion never meant that much to me. I went. And he said, yeah, when all this happened to me, I didn't even want to go to communion because Jesus didn't help me. But again, over time, with that growth in faith, hope, and love, a couple different Eucharistic ministers came to him. And he said, Father, he said, I came to deeply believe. I came to deeply believe this wasn't just physical food to somehow nourish me, but spiritual food that could help me and remind me God was a part of me. He didn't use this language, but I thought of it in the gospel today. When he came to really receive Jesus and saw Jesus as the bread of life. And if we interpret it even more by the Jewish tradition, the bread of vital life. And so whenever anybody would come, he looked forward to communion. He received communion. He had the kind of faith by this time to be open and be nourished by God. Not only by that physical communion, but by the people who brought it, that were caring for him, and ultimately by a God that he knew was always there for him. He went on and he has shared that message with lots of people. And he lived in a suburb of Cleveland, West Side. And maybe today we can all be reminded that whatever experiences we may be going through and we're feeling down and out, that's legitimate. That's human. We can feel that. At the same time, be open over time to hearing friends and family and our God say, I'm there for you. Don't give up. I will love you through this. Again, what's the message each of us need to hear today and maybe to pass on to somebody we know? God bless you.